Russian oligarchs have mind-boggling wealth.
Russia's economy is bleeding out.
The banking crisis in Russia is certainly a juicy one.
Putin's Russia is going bankrupt. After nearly 22 years of glorious times, the country is now at the most critical juncture in its economic history.
Food crisis.
The food crisis is worsening.
And in the middle of the war, it's a growing food crisis.
Billions of rubles are going to the war zone. Unemployment is rising, real incomes are falling, and budget deficits are reaching record levels. People may not be protesting in the streets, but they are doing so within their homes. Pockets are burning. Families are breaking up. Moreover, it is not just money that is running out, but also human resources. Those who have the opportunity are fleeing the country, even Putin's elite ranks. The number of people to work in factories is decreasing. Russia's labor shortage is constantly increasing compared to previous years. According to data from the Russian Ministry of Labor, it is predicted that the Russian economy will need 10.9 million new workers by 2030. Losses on the front lines, the inability to employ young workers to replace retirees, and those fleeing the country are triggering this. The Kremlin, which is constantly sending soldiers to the front, is trying to compensate for the labor shortage in the domestic market with migrant labor. But this is not enough either. The state's hope is turning back to oil. However, oil and natural gas are no longer Putin's trump card, but one of the only factors cushioning Russia's defeat in the war. 13.5% of refineries are closed, reserves are running out, and imports are limited. Consequently, Russia's closest allies are planning to abandon the sinking ship, economically speaking. China is one of the most important examples of this. It is known that Chinese banks have turned off the money tap to Russia. The situation has become so critical that the Kremlin is now approaching the white flag not only on the front lines, but also in the treasury. At this point, everything needs to be discussed openly. The fact that the targeted deficit ratio for the first half of the year was reached long ago indicates that the pace of spending has crushed the revenue dynamics. The math of this equation, written by the decline in energy revenues and the increase in spending, is simple. The government will have to use reserves to close the gap and discuss new budget revisions as the year progresses. The share of defense and security spending in the total has reached historic levels, and the side effect of this is pressure on social spending and investment budgets. As long as interest rates remain in double digits, it is difficult for investment appetite to make a permanent comeback. Therefore, official growth expectations are being revised downward. The cost of credit is high, demand is fragile, and the private sector is cautious. The loss of momentum in domestic demand and delays in investment projects are creating an agenda that focuses more on cash flow than ratings. The triple whammy of high war spending, plus weak energy prices, plus expensive credit, leaves the economic management with a narrow corridor. Every step taken in this corridor makes the next decision even more costly. As oil and its derivatives, the most critical item on the revenue side, continue to lag behind desired ruble levels, the budget math breaks down. The ruble's periodic strengthening and the softening of global oil prices are leading to a realization below the ruble target per barrel. This exacerbates cash flow problems and brings forward the need for additional financing. When controls in the supply chain and the tightening of price cap regimes are added to this, discount pressure becomes inevitable. Regulatory steps in the port, tanker, and insurance triangle increase shadow fleet risk premiums. On the European side, successive sanctions packages are hitting both energy revenues and access to critical technology. The scope of these sanctions, extending to ships, finance, intermediary channels, and intermediate goods, makes circumvention moves costly. The signal for the next steps is also clear. The focus of new sanctions is to narrow banking, energy transportation, and sanctions circumvention methods. In short, on the revenue side, collection is difficult, the risk premium is high, and the discount is permanent. This picture shows that the Treasury is waking up to a more difficult arithmetic every month. Now let's get to the most critical link: financing channels. Access to Western finance has long been restricted. The aim was to partially compensate for this gap through Asia. However, as the risk of secondary sanctions grows, major Asian banks are also avoiding visible risk. Over the past year, Chinese banks have either delayed or completely cut off numerous transactions, creating a necessity to shift to local indirect models. This is a clear setback in terms of speed and cost. More importantly, there have been clear examples of even small regional banks in China halting Russian transactions. Moreover, this restriction is not limited to a single bank. It is part of a broader cautious approach. As a result, the payment side of trade is becoming more complex, slower, and more open to scrutiny. Russian companies are forced to open intermediary accounts in China and manage payment flows using a split approach. This increases friction at every stage of trade and prolongs cash flow. In this environment, Russian banks have attempted to reduce visibility by establishing netting arrangements known as the China line. The netting scheme aims to close transactions using the logic of offsetting rather than direct interbank transfers. But such an architecture faces speed and scale issues, and windows are shrinking as counterparty compliance tests increase. It is even known that large state banks have silenced certain channels in response to the risk of sanctions expansion. This pushes the Russian side to fragment flows and add more intermediaries. Each new intermediary, each new account, means cost and delay. The blind spot area is shrinking not only in energy and commodity trade, but also in machinery and electronic inputs. Compliance departments, bank audits, and regulatory correspondence are now critical files in every payment cycle. The net result is simple. The flow continues, but fluidity is lost. And this loss creates a risk of permanent damage to growth and productivity. This risk of damage could force Putin to make forced sales to traditional partners. China, in particular, is the largest potential buyer at the table. It is suggested that Putin wants to sell Russia's strategic resources to China or pledge them as collateral through 50 to 100-year leases. This is not just an economic move, it is also a dramatic step that would mortgage the country's resource sovereignty for the future. The Kremlin may present these sales as a national necessity, but the reality is that this is a rescue operation. Moreover, it is a sale that could have lasting consequences. It is alleged that Putin made such offers to China last year and that Beijing responded cautiously. Xi Jinping faces a difficult equation. On the one hand, expanding global energy access, and on the other, not opening a new economic front with the West. Because if China responds positively to these sales and revives Putin's war economy with a kind of emergency cash injection, Europe cannot be expected to remain indifferent. At this point, Europe would have two strong responses: to abandon its silent resistance to NATO expansion in Asia. Increasing military presence in China's neighbors could be on the agenda. To align customs tariffs on Chinese goods with those of the US. In other words, to create a direct contraction in export markets for China. Xi Jinping does not like either option. His affection for Putin is not deep enough to cover China's economic costs. What Xi will prefer is not Putin's "call your friend" lifeline, but light assistance. This lifeline can be cut off through diplomatic efforts. Starmer, Macron and Merz, calling Xi Jinping one after another, should be enough to achieve this. However, taking preventive measures is much better than intervening after a crisis. Prime Minister Starmer, President Macron and Chancellor Merz, please pick up the phone and talk to President Xi Jinping. Coordinate your approach and convey it to China. It will work and it will be enough. This is Europe's job, and Ukraine needs to focus on what it does best: strategically attacking to cripple Russia's war machine. Ukraine attacked the Novokubashevsk oil refinery, one of Russia's largest refineries. This major attack, carried out with 17 UAVs, destroyed 4.1% of Russia's refinery capacity in a single strike. However, what caught our attention was not the scale of the attack or the amount of capacity taken offline. What was important was that this was the second attack on the same refinery in just 3 weeks. The first attack took place on August 2nd, the second on August 28th. This reveals a critical weakness. Putin cannot defend his most valuable assets. I don't think this is due to a lack of effort. There should be at least mobile artillery units around that refinery, and perhaps even short-range air defense systems protecting such a strategic facility. If they had adequate protection, and Ukraine still managed to breach their defenses, that would be a very troubling situation for Moscow. If there is no meaningful defense, the situation is even worse. Both scenarios indicate a fundamental problem for Putin's war effort. The consequences are staggering. If Ukraine can strike a refinery more than 1,000 kilometers from its border, with double-digit numbers of unmanned aerial vehicles, then everything of value within that 1,000-kilometer radius now carries a potential destruction label. All industrial infrastructure in the West is now vulnerable to systematic disruption. This is precisely why it would be economically illogical for China to provide financial aid to Putin. If Xi provides $100 billion in support, Ukraine could systematically destroy $100 billion worth of Russian infrastructure. This is a losing proposition for Beijing. Hopefully, Starmer, Macron and Merz will emphasize this mathematical reality to Xi Jinping during their diplomatic contacts. There is no logic in China harming itself while trying to keep Putin's failed war machine afloat. This means a waste of resources, and more importantly, the squandering of China's future trade prospects with Europe and the West. Domestically, another front has opened up. The peace of the capitalist class has been disrupted. The policy of realignment towards the oligarchic pool is progressing with different files at the same time. While suspicious deaths and mysterious disappearances occupy the public agenda on the one hand, investigations into high-profile business people are accelerating on the other. The wave of nationalization, legitimized by the rhetoric of a war economy, weakens the guarantee of private property. This shatters the elite's perception of a protected zone and deepens the crisis of confidence. The losses are not only legal, they are also growing in terms of reputation, control, and access to credit. The risk premium for the private sector doubles in such periods. The reflex of capital is clear. Divide assets, shift family and management centers to judicial circles they perceive as safe, and avoid remaining in the open. These behaviors disrupt investment and long-term planning. As the phrase, "let's wait and see," becomes more prevalent in the economy, stagnation sets in. Let's discuss a concrete case. Uralzaloto, one of the country's largest gold producers, was subject to a nationalization decision. The prosecutor's office requested that the majority stake be transferred to the state, and the courts acted swiftly. During this process, market value fluctuated, credibility became a topic of debate, and discussions arose about who would gain management control. Not only did ownership change hands, but the subsequent sale of the asset to state-dominated financial institutions was also planned. This is consistent with the Nationalize, Reassign scheme. The crux of the matter is that the guarantee of private property is no longer unconditional. In such an environment, risk measurement gives way to political risk assessments. Capital costs rise as a result, and numerous projects enter a wait-and-see mode. The case is etched into the memory of capital. Ultimately, the private sector receives a strong message that the rules of the game have changed. Moreover, this is not an exception. During the same period, there were decisions to seize and place under receivership airports, logistics centers, and major agricultural players. The legal framework was expanded with the brackets strategic sector and national security. The total amount seized over 3 years reached tens of billions of dollars. Asset transfers of this magnitude shift the ownership structure in the economy in favor of the state. When the state struggles to effectively operate the assets it has taken over, new burdens arise for the budget. With spending pressure already at record levels, inefficient nationalizations increase costs. Financially, these steps also pose a risk to the quality of assets in the banking sector. This is because the credit relationships and collateral structures of the companies changing hands become uncertain. In the eyes of foreign investors, the country's risk rating rises. All of this further sharpens the dilemma of property security versus internal security. Brussels and capitals are not sitting idle. There are new measures on the legal front and critical decisions in ongoing lawsuits. European institutions have achieved tangible gains in the judicial process against challenges from sanctioned individuals and companies. This strengthens the compliance departments as much as it does the resilience of the lists. At the same time, the legal architecture aimed at preventing initiatives that could lead to investment-state disputes has also been updated. Thus, the scope for compensation claims against Europe based on expropriation allegations is narrowed. The logic of the package is not only economic, it also targets legal deterrence. Therefore, the model of seeking rights abroad, managing at home, is losing ground. The message is clear for elite circles. Legal escape routes are narrowing. This means that the combination of nationalization plus litigation at home could generate more cases. And this picture turns into a wall of thickening financial isolation. This tension and increased costs translate into slower growth and tighter budgets in the macro picture. In the medium term, more tax increases and civil spending cuts are on the table. Such steps put pressure on already fragile consumer confidence and investment plans. The parts of the economy inflated by war employment do not generate lasting prosperity because they are not productive. If there is employment but no productivity, the wage price spiral and exchange rate pass-through keep the cost of living high. Such a balance is directly felt in the daily life of the man on the street. Fuel prices, food, transportation, and public service bills are the invisible names of the war tax. As the year progresses, the political cost of budget discipline also increases. The household's threshold of endurance is psychological, not economic. Even if inflation approaches the single-digit threshold, purchasing power remains suppressed as long as price levels remain high. The combined effect of increases in rent, transportation, food, and energy bills is a tangible burden for the masses. When wage increases fail to offset this burden, consumption patterns are curtailed. This curtailment has a ripple effect on retail, services, and SMEs. Credit interest and installment costs also squeeze household budgets. In such periods, future spending is postponed and durable consumption declines. As market sentiment deteriorates, investor and household psychology feed off each other. This further narrows the growth channel. There is no single recipe for recovery, but the first condition is clear: trust. Without confidence, there is no money and no momentum. The rational steps the system can take at this point are clear, but the political cost is high. Strengthening property guarantees, putting a stop to arbitrary expropriations, and prioritizing the rule of law are the first steps. Second, budget discipline must be removed from the shadow of war spending and re-established with a medium-term plan. Third, it is to renew trust in the Asian line with transparent protocols that will provide balance in banking and payment channels. Fourth, it is to remove tax increases as the only option and to protect productivity investments. Fifth, it is to draw up a credible program for disinflation without crushing social spending. Unless these are done, even an interest rate cut alone will not provide relief. Because the trust gap cannot be filled with interest rates. Without trust, capital will not commit to the long term. Without the long term, today's problems will return tomorrow, even bigger. And precisely for this reason, what we are talking about today is not a matter of timing, but a matter of direction. As we stray further from trust and speed, the word bankruptcy will be heard more often. This word is sometimes heard not in courtrooms, but in markets, banks, and factories. It is felt in household budgets, read in SME balance sheets, and noticed in the investment calendars of large groups. The class we call oligarchs is the first to sense this direction. Their behavior signals the rest of the system. The signal they are sending today is clear. Sustainability is impossible with insecure property and expensive finance. Therefore, assets turning inward are also not safe. Waves of nationalization and cleanup narratives cannot replace growth. As long as they cannot, the phrase "Putin is going bankrupt" will be heard more often, because the balance sheet is more stubborn than the slogan. If you liked this video, don't forget to subscribe, share your thoughts in the comments, and support us to reach more people with this content. See you in the next videos. Thank you for watching.